Georgia looking to make it 3 national titles in a 4-year span, helping us break down all things Georgia football in the 2024 season. Our good friend Graham Coffey of Dawgs Central does a fantastic job covering all things Georgia. Graham, what's going on, man? Appreciate you taking the time. It was great to link up with you, by the way, in Dallas, and happy we're able to do this.
It was, man. We had a lot of fun. Got to play some video games. Played more video games, I think, in those 2 days than I have since, honestly. But yeah, awesome. And man, we're getting there. It's full go on the preview front. There's fall camp reports coming out, and we'll blink and it will be Labor Day, and then we'll blink again and it will be Halloween, and then we'll blink again and it will be New Year's. So ready for that sprint to the finish of 2024.
Yeah, Graham, it's interesting. We're at the point of the year where you pray for no news, because no news is good news, as we've seen across the country. Texas has a major player suffer an injury, some other places. You pray you don't hear anything. It's a boring fall camp, right? That's the best thing you can get. But let's dive into it, Graham. Talk some Georgia. Before we look at the 2024 season, let's take a moment, Graham, reflect on 2023. Georgia went 13-1, 8-0 in conference play. I mean, the Dogs, they had their issues here and there. I recall talking to some folks, well, the defensive line doesn't look quite as elite. They're still top 20 in the country, right? Like, Georgia couldn't win by enough early in the season. They're playing these non-conference games against the likes of Tennessee, Martin, Ball State, UAB, because Georgia, you could tell, they weren't being compared as, well, are you the best team in the SEC? They were being compared against the expectations of, are you good enough to win 3 straight national championships? So it was a very high bar, but Georgia went unblemished until they lost, Graham, at the worst time you could possibly lose. And that old snake, Nick Saban, bit him again in the SEC championship in Atlanta, 27-24. The loss. Georgia gets left out of the college football playoff when you could argue maybe they still deserve to go. I mean, I said it after the fact. I'm sure you'd agree. I still thought they were the best team in college football last year. They showed that in the bowl game, the Orange Bowl against Florida State. And I get FSU had guys sitting out, but 63-3, Georgia flexed their muscles. So again, not many programs, Graham, would be disappointed with the kind of year that Georgia had, but I'm curious to get your vantage point and the overall vibe of Georgia fans. How do they look back on the 2023 season?
Yeah, I think they look back on that season fondly, right? They won every game in the regular season. Like, they still have not lost a regular season game since 2020 in Jacksonville to Dan Mullen. Like, there is not an active SEC coach who has beaten Kirby Smart at the school that they currently coach at. Hugh Freeze is the only one who has beaten him at all. And he was at Ole Miss in 2016 when that happened. So yeah, it's vibes are good still. I think that there is, when you get down into that season and you start talking about this season, right? Like, every talk for 2024 is kind of framed within, well, how did we lose to Alabama? Like, that is sort of the standard of, like, okay, well, they couldn't get pressure with 4 on Milroe in the second half, or through a lot of that game against Alabama in Atlanta. Like, we better be able to get pressure with 4 this year. Those are the things that I think people are talking about, which is fair, I think, considering Georgia's schedule this year. Like, Georgia's schedule last year, I'm going to be honest, man, like, it's fun to cover Georgia right now when, they're sort of the center of the football world and all that. But, like, last year's schedule was a little bit tough to get up for every week. There were some weeks where I skipped doing quite as deep a preview just because we know what's going to happen here, right? I think Georgia looks at this Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss slate and says, like, we're going to have to be pretty damn good to go and, feel like we've been successful when we get to the end of that. So I think folks are certainly, national title has become the expectation. That is kind of the way the game works, right? Like, everybody complains about you not winning a national title until you do. And then once you do, everybody expects one every year. I think that it's kind of quiet right now for Georgia in camp. It seems like last year, with Georgia's schedule being kind of weak, I think Kirby Smart really did give them, like, the worst fall camp that they had ever been through. And I'm not saying they're not working hard and all that right now, because I think they certainly are. But I also think that this kind of early going first week of fall camp has been maybe a little bit more like put some reps on younger players, a little more rotation. They're certainly not pushing anybody to, play through like an injury or anything like that. So I think that they kind of see the big picture a little bit and think we're going to play 16 to 17 games this year. And we need to be ready for that from a depth standpoint and from an energy standpoint.
Graham, you mentioned Kirby Smart. It's crazy to think he's entering his 9th season in Athens. Time flies. Typically I'm asking people about what's the vibe around the feelings around the head coach. Obviously, I think Georgia fans, the approval rating is sky high for Kirby Smart. What he's done with that program, I mean, how could it not be? My questions for you, Graham, more so center around the future with Kirby. Again, like I said, this is 9th season, and I think gone are the days we're going to see the likes of Bobby Bowden or maybe Nick Saban, guys who were in the coaching profession for 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, with the way the money is and the demands of the job, you and I talked off the air, off record about NIL portal, way it's changed the game. What is the feeling amongst Georgia media, Georgia fans, those that support the program? What's the feeling around like what the future of the program holds with Kirby? Is it a 5-year window? Do you give him 7 to 8 more years? Because again, I don't think Kirby's a guy, and I know you've echoed this. I don't think he's going to be at Georgia another 20 years. It's just those days are gone. So in regard to the future, what's the vibe of those surrounding Georgia in regards to Kirby Smart leading the program in the coming years, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, Kirby's still only 48, right? Like, so, I think that's worth remembering is that he did get this position at a very young age. But no, I don't see him coaching to 70, and he'll tell, I think, pretty much anybody that. Like, I think he's pretty frank about that. Now, he's certainly not frank about, hey, we've got this window. I've got a 5-year window. I mean, they just put him under contract through, I think, 2033. Now that doesn't mean anything. I mean, Saban was under contract for more years, obviously, when he walked away. Guys walk away from contracts all the time. But point being on that, I think that Kirby wants to have some level of longevity. Like, I think that he would like to look back on like a solid 20-ish year run at Georgia or a 15-ish year run at Georgia. I think he has people around him. Kirby's always been really good about working with like sports psychologists and folks like that can kind of help him. I think there was early days of NIL and portal where he was really frustrated and, was just kind of like, this isn't why I got into this to coach football. I didn't get into it to be a fundraiser. I certainly didn't get into it to be held hostage by kids who say, this school just called and they're offering me 1.5 million and I make, 10% of that here or whatever it is. Like, I think that he decided, to kind of let go of some of that and say, we're really good at what we do. We develop, we do all these things. We're going to compete for national titles every year. And he told his kids before spring practice, basically like, we have a very good chance to win a national title together. If you want to leave, go ahead. Like, someone's going to call you and they're going to offer you more money. They're going to offer you whatever. But are you going to look back when it gets to January and your teammates are playing for something bigger and you're not there? Are you going to feel like you missed out on something? Or are you going to feel like that you missed out on some development that might help you get where you want to go in the NFL draft? And so he's kind of embraced that philosophy of, I can't control people tampering with my kids. I can't control what these kids are going to do. And I also think that we offer guys a pretty good value in terms of maximizing, their potential when it comes to draft time at the end of their 3 to 4 years. And I'm going to remind them of that. And if they want the short-term money, then hey, hats off to you. So I think accepting that has kind of created an ease around him. He was, not that he doesn't always present well at SEC media days and all that, because he does, but I thought he was particularly relaxed, honestly, in Dallas when we were there a few weeks ago. And I think that will help him. I think that acceptance will help him. I think that he feels pretty good about some of the House versus NCAA settlement changes that are coming down the pipe. So if I had to peg him right now, I don't think there's anything like imminent. I think that, I think he's got another 5 years in him. I don't know if he's got another 10 years in him, but I feel pretty good that he's got another 5 years in him. I think he could kind of hit that 15-year mark at Georgia, say, I'm 53, what do I want to do now, like moving forward? But he's gotten better about taking time in the offseason, traveling with his kid to Little League baseball tournaments and doing things with his family. So I think that balance for him is important. And I think everybody in the administration at Georgia has really encouraged him to continue finding that. There's nobody's going to be mad if you don't show up to work one day in the middle of, June or July or whatever it is.
So, Graham, as we do our deep dive in the 2024 Georgia Bulldogs, let's start on the offensive side of the football. It's year 2 of Mike Bobo and Carson Beck together. That should spell big things for the Dogs offense. Carson Beck, obviously, well, I say obviously, maybe quietly led the SEC in passing. We don't hear that talked about enough. The big question mark, of course, Graham, that I'm sure you've been asked about 1,000 times, how do the Dogs replace Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey? Those are the two dudes. Those are the playmakers. You saw how it impacted Georgia late last year when they started to get dinged up a little bit. We're not 100% in the SEC title, and we all saw what happened. Dominic Lovett emerging as the likely wide receiver 1. Dylan Bell is back, who's a really versatile weapon. We all know about the Rob Thomas dismissal at wide receiver. That's going to take a toll. Some other guys have got to step up, but there's plenty of talent in that wide receiver room. Trevor Etienne, that was the big pickup over the offseason, arriving in from Florida. He's going to be the top ball carrier in the backfield at the running back position, brings a new dynamic that offense Georgia probably didn't have a season ago. At the tight end spot, again, we mentioned Brock Bowers gone. Oscar Delp is a guy that's probably an NFL body, has played good snaps for Georgia. Stanford transfer Benjamin Urasek. You and I talked about him at Media Days. Yeah. The staff is really high on him. They both lead the charge at tight end. And 4 of 5 starters, maybe most importantly, return on the offensive line. You do have to replace your center. Was it Cedric Van Pran from a year ago that was the center?
Yeah.
You got to replace him. And anytime you have to replace him, that's kind of the quarterback of your offensive line. That's a storyline to follow. But, I mean, Georgia's as deep as anybody in the country on the offensive line. So, Graham, when you look at this Georgia offense, is it fair to say that even with losing Bowers and McConkey, and you got to find dudes to replace them, more importantly, not even from a statistical standpoint, but step up in those big moments, right? Who's going to be Brock Bowers late against Auburn this year, right? Like, who's going to be that guy? Who's going to be Ladd McConkey converting a critical third down this year? But with that being said, looking on paper with talent, year 2 of Bobo and Beck, I mean, is it fair to say this offense could be even better than it was a season ago?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Certainly statistically, just, I know that there's a chance they'll play more games, but just talking about the 12-game regular season, like, they started pretty slow last year. The offensive line struggled. The offensive line is, kind of had a habit of starting a little slow early in seasons for a while now, truthfully, except for that 2022 Oregon game. They started quickly that time. But, I think that it's fair to say that they could be in the conversation for the best offense in the country. I think they were, kind of in that conversation when they were at their best last year, when they had a healthy Brock Bowers and a healthy Ladd McConkey on the field together. It was pretty dynamic. I think the question for them is sort of, you alluded to it there, but just who's going to be that guy in those big moments. And in some ways, I think it helps them to be a little more varied, right? Like, Todd Monken at Georgia was really good about having like 8 to 12 guys who could score a touchdown on you. And as a defense, you couldn't really just be like, we're going to take this one guy away. I thought there were times last year where Georgia got a little bit too focused on, we got to get Brock his touches, or we got to get Ladd his touches. And particularly in Atlanta, when those guys were both injured, thought that hurt them. It'll be interesting to see sort of how that plays out this year. You've got RHOBACK Thomas gone, as you alluded to. I think that's a big thing for Colby Young, honestly, the Miami transfer. He's a true X-receiver body. He's 6'4", 6'5". He's 220. He's got speed. He's taken screens to the house while he was at Miami. He's taken, he was one of the best contested catch guys in this ACC last year. Georgia really didn't have that in 2023, so I think that's big for them to have in 2024. You get Dylan Bell back. You have Lovett. Interesting pieces like Anthony Evans coming up. You still have speedy Arian Smith. Like, there's a lot of dynamic weapons. I think the thing that people are sleeping on a little bit with Georgia's offense is the running backs. And truthfully, I mean, the intel out of fall camp so far about the running backs has been a bit surprising from the standpoint of, yes, we knew Etienne was good. He was looking great all spring, but Branson Robinson, had a ruptured patella tendon during fall camp this time last year. And not seeing that injury that much, you don't really know how he was going to recover from that. There was people who, wondered if it would alter his career forever. Like that in the NFL 10 years ago, that could be a career ender for running backs. And all of the talk about him through the first week of fall camp is like, not only does he look really healthy, he looks better than he's ever looked from a sense of he's a bit lighter. He's a little more twitchy so far. He's not even playing with like a brace or anything like that. He looks super confident cutting on it. Watch out for him is my point. Like, I think that you're going to turn on the TV, Georgia Clemson week 1. And, there was a point in time where the prognosis for him was not to be cleared until November for any contact at all. So he's had a pretty remarkable recovery curve there. And I think on the offensive line, Jared Wilson is the guy replacing Cedric Van Pran. He's a little bigger than Van Pran. He is extremely athletic. I mean, there's a clip going on around on Twitter right now of him pancaking Deion Walker from Kentucky when he came into that game last year. Like, he's a good player. There's the consistency and there's the mental checks and all of that stuff. It'll be interesting to see, but I think they feel good about him. The scary spot for them maybe would be if something happened to him. They don't really have another true center. I mean, they've tried to cross train their guards and all of that, but like they just don't have that other guy that you feel like is definitely coming in like Wilson was for them last year. I think that, Beck is Carson Beck. Like, he's gotten very comfortable in the Georgia offense. He is an extremely fast processor. He sees things quickly. He gets the ball out quickly. That's, the best thing for Georgia's offensive line that you can find. And it will be very interesting to see, I think, how they look against Clemson in week 1. That's a test right off the bat. I know Clemson is not the program that it was maybe 8 years ago when they were, beating Alabama in national title games, but they still are a very good team with good pieces on the line of scrimmage, and there's not a ton of programs in college football that have some of the personnel that they have up front. So it'll be a good test for Georgia to kind of see how they match up against that and maybe give them a few weeks to adjust some things before they have to go play Alabama and Tuscaloosa.
Graham, let's switch sides of the football and talk about the defense. And it's funny, the question I have written down here is, can the defense get back to being elite? Which, by most other team standards, it would be an elite defense. But we're talking about Kirby Smart standards, and the line of scrimmage just wasn't elite last year. It was top 20 good, but it wasn't top 5 good. So that's the question. You get Nazir Stackhouse, Warren Brinson, Michael Williams. They're all back up front. Smail Munden, C.J. Allen are featured at linebacker. Obviously, Jamon Dumas-Johnson went to Kentucky, but part of that reason is probably because he saw other guys stepping up, taking his snaps. That's how good the linebacker room is. Dalen Everett back at corner. Malachi Starks, one of the SEC's best at the safety spot, is back. There are some questions in the secondary when it comes to some youth, but you got some great answers. I mean, guys like Ellis Robinson, K.J. Bolden. I mean, we're talking about the best of the best that signed at Georgia. They're going to be early factors. I was listening to somebody talk about the way Kirby Smart's face lit up talking about K.J. Bolden was kind of like how he talked about Malachi Starks a couple years ago. So those guys very well will factor in. Your thoughts on the defense, Graham? And I feel silly asking you, will the defense be elite again? Because it was
it's a fair question.
It was really freaking good last year. But do you think this defense has an opportunity to get back to Kirby Smart's standard of elite?
Yeah, so I think they have an opportunity for sure. I think that the linebacking group is as good as any I've seen. I mean, there's not like a Roquan Smith necessarily. I mean, some of these guys might end up being like drafted almost as highly as Roquan was by the time their careers are over, but there's not, a guy who's like that right now. But they've got so many linebackers that it's a little bit insane. And like they've kind of started recruiting these linebackers that are like 6'3", 6'4", that also come down and play edge but are, then comfortable following backs out of the backfield. And like they've just got a bunch of freaky bodies like that can kind of come in and like they can play 3-4 linebackers and really mix personnel and sort of blitz from anywhere. So I think that's going to be kind of fun to watch, honestly, defensively for them, is just to kind of see where the pressure comes from at the second level. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. Well, the defensive line is just, that's going to be the thing to monitor for Georgia, right? Like there's nothing in the secondary to really have concern about. There's depth everywhere. They've got 3 guys that could start at boundary corner today that they only have 2 spots for. Like all of that will be fine. The safety spot will be fine. But at defensive line, I think they have some things to prove. They got, I wouldn't say they got pushed around by Alabama. I think they're kind of, there was like a Twitter clip that came around of Nazir Stackhouse getting double teamed by a couple interior linemen, and people were like, "Oh, Alabama, they dominated Georgia up front." It's like, I mean, it was a really great play and a great double team block by those guys, but like they ran for like 3.4 yards a carry, I think, in that game. Like it wasn't like they were gashing folks left and right, but that's how the internet works, of course. I think, though, my point being, they were not up to that standard last year. They did not have that guy at the interior of the defensive line who could force a double team. Like they had guys who got double teamed sometimes, but they didn't have a Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis or even a Devontae Wyatt who it was like, if you don't double team this dude, you're about to have problems. Didn't really get much pass rush from the interior at all. And that caused linebackers to have to come down out of coverage at times if Georgia wanted to get pressure. I think that is the big X factor for them, is those defensive tackles. They've got Mykel Williams to play, as an edge defender. They've got other guys like Jalen Walker. They got 3 kids that are becoming sophomores right now that play defensive end or edge that were all ranked as a 5-star at some point in the recruiting cycle that they were part of. So like, I think they'll be fine in terms of finding pass rush on the outside. They got to find somebody on the interior to step up and just, get some push. You don't have to be Jordan Davis. You don't have to be Jalen Carter, but you got to just kind of create some problems sometimes. Who that will be very interesting. Nazir Stackhouse is back after being a 2-year starter. Was really good in 2022, kind of took a step back in 2023. We'll see 2024. They've got guys. I mean, they have more 300-plus pound defensive linemen than anyone in the SEC. I think they have 11 300-plus pound defensive linemen on their roster. So I don't want to like read off all those names for you. I mean, Warren Brinson is certainly one to watch. He was good last year against Alabama. He was kind of probably the high point from the interior of the defensive line in terms of pass rush. But yeah, it will be very interesting to see what they find there, because I think that could really just kind of crack open everything else for that defense. Every other unit is good enough to be really, really, really like high level. But if that defensive tackle group can make a little bit of a leap, then I think you've got an elite unit on your hands.
Graham, let's talk a little special teams. Brett Thorson is back at kicker. Peyton Woodring back at punter. Dylan Bell's probably a guy who's going to factor in the return game somewhat. There are weapons. There are athletes that can make big plays in that facet of the game. Anything notable in your mind when it comes to Georgia special teams? Again, always a good sign when you got your kicker and your punter back from a season ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Thorson's probably one of the best punters in the country. He was the one that kicked that 75-yard punt against Tennessee in 2022 in that game. That was like a perfect coffin corner kind of situation and backed them up on their one. Woodring is good. He was a newcomer last year, and I think kind of outperformed expectations. The return game will be interesting for them. They get Anthony Evans back as well on punts. You've got Dylan Bell and some of those guys you're talking about for kickoff. Evans had never returned a punt at Georgia until the Alabama game. They brought him in late in that game, and he almost broke one for a touchdown. So I think it'll just be kind of interesting to see if they get something sort of dynamic at punt returner there for the first time in a while. I know that kick returns seem to happen less and less every year, it feels like, but that certainly can change a big game, as we know. So they may have a guy back there this year who is as good as anyone they've had in quite a while.
So, Graham, 15 starters are back for Kirby Smart squad, 9 on the offense, 6 on the defense. And you mentioned, last year it seemed there were many storylines, obviously a lot off the field, but one of them was Georgia's weak schedule. Yeah, we're not talking about that this year because Georgia opens up with Clemson in Atlanta and what's going to be a really fun neutral site game. You then got Tennessee Tech. Then you open up SEC play at Kentucky at night at Kroger Field. Don't sleep on that matchup. Could be interesting. Then week 4, after a bye week, it's the big one, Graham, at Alabama, facing Kalen DeBoer. That is a monster game. You then get Auburn, Mississippi State, at Texas. You've got Florida in the cocktail party. You're at Ole Miss, Tennessee, UMass, and Georgia Tech. So it's a really difficult schedule. I mean, like I mentioned, Clemson in that opener, at Texas, at Ole Miss, at Alabama. When you look at this schedule, what's the first thing that jumps out to you as the Dogs have to navigate that slate to get a third national title in 4 years?
I think the thing that jumps out really is just all those games that you're talking about are on the road. All those big, exciting games are on the road. I know they get Tennessee and Auburn at home. And look, who knows? I think it's possible you could pop up and Tennessee could be a really big game by the time you get to that kind of later in the schedule. But yeah, they're going to have to be road warriors in 2024, and it's going to be kind of a grind for them, I think, at times. But it's going to be a lot of fun to cover, and I think that like Georgia, if this was a year ago in a 4-team playoff, I think there'd probably be a great deal of anxiety around the schedule because there's not, look, Georgia fans are never going to be like accepting of a loss, but I think, there's a reasonable sort of sense there of this is going to be a pretty tough schedule and it's going to be fun to watch. And we're lucky to have all these big games. So let's go play them and kind of see what happens. And when we get to the playoff, we'll really find out the rest. Right. So it's going to be interesting. I think that for Georgia, I'm very fascinated to see not just for Georgia, but Georgia in relation to the rest of the league and the rest of college football. How much does the depth that Kirby Smart has recruited pay off? Like, I know that we talk this time of year a lot about, the returning starters and all of that, but I think that with the gauntlet that everybody's going to have to run, and particularly the gauntlet that Georgia's going to have to run, that third stringer might become more important than ever before. And I think that Georgia's done as good a job of recruiting competitive depth as anybody. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that manifests and where those guys come into a sense of importance, maybe when we get to the 12-team deal here in January.
Graham, like I mentioned, week 4, or essentially week 5, following the bye week, but at Alabama, how important is that game for Kirby Smart and Georgia? Because the question's been asked.
Sure.
Was it a Nick Saban problem or is it an Alabama problem? How important is it for Georgia? Even though it's on the road at night at Bryant-Denny, how important is it for Georgia to go in and win that game?
I think it's important. I mean, I think if anybody tells you it's not important, that they're bullshitting you, honestly. Sorry. I don't know if I should
You're good.
I'm allowed to. Okay. Yeah, I think that, look, like Georgia fans are tired of losing to Alabama. You got Saban gone. I think that Kirby sometimes overthought things against Nick a little bit, Look, it's Kirby Smart. The dude's not lost a regular season game in like almost 4 years now. So, and I'm just a guy. So like, I'm not sitting here being like, oh, like Kirby, should have done X, Y, or Z necessarily. But there were times where Georgia kind of did things against Alabama that they didn't do in any other game of the year. And sometimes it felt like maybe if they just kind of stuck to what they'd known, it might have gone differently for them. So I'm interested to see if sort of removing Nick from that equation and just how well Kirby and Nick knew each other kind of take some of the chess out, and maybe they just stick to playing checkers a little bit more this time around. I think that this game will be extremely big for both teams. I'll put it this way, like it might be in a rematch either way, right? Like they might see each other again, whether that's in the playoff or the SEC title, but you don't want to go into Tuscaloosa if you're Georgia and give Kalen DeBoer that win to go use on the recruiting trail. You don't. And I think that you also like don't want to find yourself in a situation where that narrative comes less about Nick Saban and more about Alabama. I think for Georgia, like that game is the one that, you know, they need to just come out there and like, if they were to go out there and just beat the snot out of Alabama, like, you know, I'm not expecting Georgia to go, you know, beat Alabama by 40 points or anything like that. But like, if they were to go out there and comfortably beat them by 21 or 14 or whatever, or at all, I should say, honestly, but I think that would, the sense for Georgia, a lot of Georgia fans would be more along the lines of relief than like, you know, excitement, but I think it would feel really, really good. I think there'd be a lot of people very, very happy. And I think that, you know, if you told Georgia fans privately, you can pick, you know, one of the three against Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss that you have to win, and, you know, the other two are going to be up for grabs, I think they would probably all pick Alabama.
So, Graham, again, Georgia looking to make it 3 national titles in a 4-year span, something that hasn't been done all that often in college football. Looking to ascend as an established, like you mentioned, that program with Nick Saban stepping down, Alabama sort of in, you know, a transitional period. In your mind, Graham, what's got to happen for Georgia to do that and make it a 3rd title in 4 years? And do you feel like because of the way, and I know what Kirby said at Media Days, I get it. We don't use failures or even successes as, you know, motivation. We don't look back and say, you know, because of this failure, we're using that as some sort of form of motivation. But do you think there will be an extra edge with Kirby Smart and this 2024, football team to sort of amend the way 2023 ended and get back to where they feel they rightfully belong?
Yeah, I do. I certainly do. I think that they, you know, that there's a different vibe. Kirby can say that, and I think that's true. I don't think that's changed how they prepared for the season necessarily, but I think from the player side of things, like, you know, I think there's a lot of guys that came back that probably wouldn't have if they'd won a national title last year. I don't know if Carson Beck and Tate Ratledge and some of those names would be back in Athens again if they had gone on and won that 3rd straight. So those guys are very motivated. I think they also realize it's a marathon, not a sprint. I am very fascinated to see how they kind of manage that energy week to week with that schedule that they have and a expanded playoff. Like going and playing at Alabama, like we were just talking about, like that's going to be a very big emotional game. Winning it will be a big thing for Georgia if that happens, but also like it's just one in a whole bunch of probably potentially big games. So I think they're going to have to kind of find that like controlled aggression and also keep an even keel and not get too high or too low kind of between some of these games.
Graham, in your mind, last thing we'll get you out of here. In your mind, offense or defense, what is the bigger question for Georgia going in the season? The thing they need to get right in order to, again, win it all this year?
Yeah, sorry, you asked me that before. And I totally
no, you're good
to answer it.
You're good.
No. I think it's that defensive line issue that we were just talking about. There's nothing on the offense I think that anyone should really be worried about. And I think the back seven of that defense is going to be very good. Might have some growing pains at time at a couple positions, but they'll be very, very good. It's the defensive line in the interior. Like they got to find some defensive tackles and a defensive end that's not named Mykel Williams that can create some havoc. Otherwise, I think it's just you're sort of playing a little bit too long in the back end at times. You're asking a little too much of that back seven, and then you're asking to bring linebackers down to get to the quarterback and so on and so forth, right? But they've got to find a defensive tackle that just, that plays a little bit nasty, not dirty, but just a little nasty, and there were times last year where it felt like guys, they weren't getting tossed around. They were okay in terms of gap responsibility, but you didn't see them getting pushed into the backfield like you had the year before. You would watch Georgia games in the pocket. It would start to collapse from the outside, but the inside would usually stay pretty stable. And there was a lot of times where quarterbacks could kind of step up because of that. So they got to figure that out.
Graham Coffey of Dawgs Central, one of the best in the business when it comes to talking all things Georgia. Graham, let folks know where they can check out all your work.
Yeah, man. Just go to dawgcentral.com. We have a subscribers forum with all sorts of intel, fall camp notes, all that good stuff up right now. But if you just hit the news tab, there are a lot of free articles that you can read. Stuff that I did a long form article on Jalen Walker today, a very interesting player for Georgia. Also, we've got athlete videos as well. So if you want to see, Malachi Starks talk about his feelings about fall camp and those types of things, we've got that up on the site right now too. So I hope you guys will come and check us out.
Graham, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Appreciate you taking the time, and we'll definitely do it again soon.
Absolutely, Chris. Always appreciate you having me on, man.